This is going to be some information a lot of you already know, but don't forget we've got Facebook. We've got people out there that need to know the whole picture, because the first question that comes to your mind after you listen to Tony is, well, why would scientists cook the books? And of course, the answer is that because once you tell a lie, you either admit you told a lie or you got to tell more lies. A lot of people call it a hoax. It's not a hoax. A hoax is designed to prick pomposity in the academic world, and it's a sort of a humorous thing. There's nothing funny about what they're doing here. The cost of lives and money and opportunities is just truly frightening. Society shifts by paradigm shifts, that whole new ideas come up and societies either accept them or reject them. What happens, and I've studied this throughout history, is that there are a few people that will grab the new paradigm and use it for its political or its financial potential for themselves. Okay, and we saw that with the extreme environmentalists and grabbing a hold of environmentalism. The question, of course, the problem is that for the majority of people, like with environmentalism, say, well, that's a good idea, but how far do we go with it? And I like to use the example of feminism, another paradigm shift. And a lot of people, yeah, great ideas, but the women were saying, well, how far do we go? And I finally figured out the role of an extremist in society. Because the role of the extremist is to start doing crazy things with that new paradigm, so that people are looking on, no, now you're going too far. In other words, the extremist has defined the limits. That's where we are now with the world. That's why the people are silent out there. Because they're starting to hear stupid things, and even they're saying, but what's happening now amongst the young people, and I talk to schools, I've taught for 25 years, environmentalism is changing. It's become a religion. It's taken a whole religious component to it. And of course, that makes it even more difficult to challenge, because the climate change is just a subset of environmentalism, right? It's big in itself, but it's really just a subset of the whole idea of environmentalism. Okay, now, Thomas Malthus, and by the way, these essays on population, Darwin took a copy of that on the Beagle with him. He thought Malthus was absolutely right. And there's some interesting undercurrents in here, because Darwin had a cousin by the name of Galton, who's the guy that created the term eugenics. So you had all of those things about population and control of population, all those ideas kicking around at the same time. Malthus said the population would outgrow the food supply. Of course, that was absolutely wrong. And if you go and look at what Malthus did, the examples he said, oh, look at America, look at the population growing there and the food supply. Of course, he ignored the fact that there was huge migration into the United States at the time. So it's just terrible, terrible science. And then there was a group called the Club of Rome that formed in 1968. And they decided that Malthus was right, but they extended it, so the population would outgrow all resources because of industrial development. That became the central theme of what we're dealing with today, that there are too many people in the planet, and each person is using too many resources, particularly the industrialized nations. So they became the focus. Because one of the questions that I try to get the public to ask themselves is, why the focus on CO2? It's all those other gases. Why CO2 become the focus? And it's one of those sort of obvious questions that's so obvious you don't think to ask it. Well, of course, we then got the population issue is really the underlying issue here. And Tony brought in Paul Ehrlich's. I can't believe he's still got a job. This is absolutely amazing. Yeah. There's hope for me yet. But Ehrlich was publishing books with this guy, John Holdren. And the book they published together was Ecoscience, Population, Resources, Environment. Okay, John Holdren is today Obama's science czar. Okay, he's the guy that created the term polar vortex, which is we knew about cold air flowing out of the Arctic or Antarctic. There's nothing new. He just gave it a new term. And he created the term, so he went from global warming to climate change to climate disruption. because he started to realize that people were saying, well, climate changes all the time. Oh, we were talking about climate disruption. Oh, well, if it's a disruption, it's interfering with natural processes, ergo it must be something humans are doing. That's the thinking that's going on here. And here's a quote from that book, and it underlines how these people operate. John Holdren wrote, "Indeed, it has been concluded that compulsory population control laws, even including laws requiring compulsory abortion, could be sustained under the existing Constitution if the population crisis became sufficiently severe to endanger the society." Let me dissect that for you for a minute. It has been concluded. Who concluded that? Who's the it? And the answer is they did. They concluded it's a problem, right? So this is setting up the straw man. And then it says that even including laws could be sustained under the existing Constitution if the population crisis became sufficiently severe. Who decides that? They do. So they set up the problem and they determine the parameters for when they invoke the necessary activities to stop the endangering of society. And I'll show you that idea comes up again in the climate issue in just a minute. Okay, of course, out of that came the first very simplistic computer model, use of computer model in resources, the limits to growth. It was grossly simple linear trends. And by the way, this is the book where peak oil became a big issue, that here's the amount of resource, we're using it at this rate, therefore we're going to run out at this point, or we'll reach the peak of its use at this point. So limits to growth, as I said, was the preamble really to the computer models of the IPCC. The Club of Rome, 1994, the president of it, Alexander King, the first global revolution. And of course, the use of the word revolution is very important. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. What they needed was something that was threatening the whole world. Because what they knew was that they couldn't get all the nation states to go along. You can see that with Kyoto, and you can see it with the Paris Accord, the Green Climate Fund, and so on. So they wanted something, and global warming, of course, fit the bill very nicely. And here's the guy. I'm ashamed to say he's Canadian. He's not with us anymore. This is Maurice Strong. And I want everybody in the world to get to know this guy and know of him. I've talked to people that went to school with him, that grew up with him in Canada, worked for him, worked against him, and so on. He was the most manipulative person, incredibly manipulative, but a superb organizer, particularly of bureaucracies. And of course that, and I'll build on this theme a little bit later, but Mary McCarthy, American social commentator, said, "Bureaucracy, the rule of no one, the modern form of despotism." And of course it's through the bureaucracies that these things are being achieved. In a book called The Cloak of Green, written by Elaine Dewar, and a superb piece of journalism. She started out a book. She wanted to praise all the Canadian environmentalists, David Suzuki, Elizabeth May. The more research she did, the more she found these people were more corrupt than the corporations they were attacking. And so she then wrote a book condemning these people. This is the key phrase here. Isn't the only hope for the planet the industrialized nation collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? And I want you to ask yourself, how would you do that? It's all very well to have these ideas, but to actually implement them, right? It's very, very difficult challenge. And of course, the answer is, if you think about the industrialized nation, which of course is using the resources at a far greater rate than anybody else and therefore has to be shut down, think about the industrialized nation as the engine in a car. You can stop the engine of the car by squeezing the fuel line. Well, if you did that with a nation, people would scream right away. Just look at what happens when there's fuel shortages somewhere. Right? Yeah. But you can also stop an engine by plugging the exhaust. That will stop the engine too. So if you can show that the byproduct of the burning of the fossil fuels is causing runaway global warming, then you've got a way of stopping the industrialized nation. So that's why CO2 became the gas of concern and focus. Okay, well then once you've got that, what do? And by the way, Dewar reached this conclusion in her book. Strong was using the UN as a platform to sell a global environment crisis and the global governance agenda. There it is, right there. And here's how he set it up. He set up the United Nations Environment Program, the Rio Declaration 1992. And I'm going to come back to that year, 1992, a little bit later on, because he also took over control of all of the energy production in the province of Ontario in that same year. Ontario, he took it from being one of the most powerful, energy-supported provinces in Canada. It is now in desperation. The citizens of Ontario are going to be paying for 40 years for what he did in that province. That's the same year he set up the Rio Declaration. He set up the political side of it, Agenda 21, of course, the Conference of the Parties. That's the political body that makes the decisions. On the scientific side, of course, he used the World Meteorological Organization to set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Why? Because if he could control the national weather bureaus, CSIRO, BOM, or NOAA, then he had direct access to the politicians. Because the politicians are not going to challenge their own scientists. Strong did this deliberately. I've talked to people that talked with him and knew all about it. And so, as I said, this link here is very, very important. Okay. And here's the most important thing, and I've just preamble to this. I used to think government inquiries were great ideas. Fabulous. Hey, yeah, finally get the politics out of the damn issue. Until I got appointed to my first commission of inquiry. And it was over a lake in Canada, and a great conflict over it. And the minister said, would you serve on the commission? Yeah, fine. When we got the terms of reference, they were so written that there was only one conclusion we could reach. It's through the terms of reference that the politicians and the bureaucrats direct. This is what Strong did here, because this is the definition of climate change given to the IPCC. A change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity. In other words, don't go looking at that natural stuff. We don't want any of those, get that sun out of here. We don't want to talk about the sun. We only want to look at human causes of climate change. And the public, most of the public think that they're still looking at total climate change. That's the deception. And of course, the IPCC makes sure that they don't get to know that. Okay, I wanted to show you this graph because it's actually from Stephen Schneider, who of course is very central to this whole climate scam business. And it's a systems diagram of atmospheric processes, and it shows you how complicated the situation actually is. When you look at all of this, I don't know, 5,000, 6,000 pieces that make up the complexity of what creates weather and climate, and they focused on CO2. Okay, so they pick one gas out of the whole thing and so virtually ignore everything else. Next slide. Here's the forcing diagram, and it doesn't matter if you can't read. You never read fine print in your life anyway, so why start now? But this is the forcing diagram of the IPCC. This is the 1995 report. And I mentioned to Tony, the 1990 report was not unreasonable. The real political influence came with the 1995 report. That's when they started to really control things. And you see here listed, there are 11 variables. And of course, those are just the human variables. And I described this as they've got a 5,000-piece puzzle, and they say they've solved the puzzle with 11 pieces. Isn't that remarkable? Well done. And of course, one of the things, well, we go to the next slide. This is the same slide in the AR5 report, but what I want you to notice over here on this side, this column says LOSU, which is level of scientific understanding. There's 11 of them there, only 2 are high. All the rest are medium or low. So the 11 that you're looking at, you don't know much about. And that hasn't improved much here into the AR5. Okay. Just very quickly, of course, the focus on CO2. This is the total atmosphere. That's the greenhouse gases in yellow. Here it's expanded to 100%. This is the CO2, the 4% of natural CO2, and that's the portion of it that's the human portion. So you start to get an idea of the scale or the dimension of what we're looking at here. And we can see it on the next graph in a more dramatic way. Here you can see CO2, methane, and of course the 95% that's water vapor. What they've done from the start, you say, well, humans produce water vapor, but the amount we produce is so small relative to the total amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, we just ignore it. But the gentleman here mentioned that it varies from 1 to 4%, and in fact, you've only got to vary water vapor in the atmosphere by 1%, it equals all of the effects of CO2. But you've already taken that out of the equation when you're looking at this particular graph. Okay, so we got a hypothesis. They created a hypothesis, anthropogenic global warming, or the hypothesis is only as good as the assumptions that you make for it. And they assume that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and as we've already discussed, I'm somewhat cynical about that, certainly cynical about the amount of greenhouse gas that it is. And they assume that a CO2 increase causes a temperature increase. I'll show you a graph in a minute which questions that. Okay, Nick? So what they said that CO2 will increase because of human industry. So they built into their assumption what will prove what they want it to prove. So they've said that humans are going to keep producing CO2 and therefore the level of CO2 in the atmosphere will continue to increase no matter what else happens. Ignore any natural variability. They've taken that out of it with this particular assumption. This, of course, is the ice core graph, or Antarctica. I remember when this came out in 1991, and Pettit and Jowsell, and they held a press conference about it, and Jowsell said, hey, don't rush to judgment on this. He said, you know, you got an 8-centimeter graph of 420,000 years. And not only that, but we've smoothed it with a 70-year smoothing average. We've taken all the variability out of it. So you really can't determine much from it. It wasn't but 5 years later that Fisher and others showed that the temperature was changing before the CO2, not as had been assumed in their, you know, that CO2 causes temperature increase. Okay, this is John Christie's presentation to the U.S. Congress, and of course I think Tony already showed this graph. This is the actual balloon and satellite observations, and this is the average of the models. And what happened after the 1990 report, and I remember this being discussed, their predictions were out by 400% in the first 5 years. And so they stopped calling them predictions and started calling them projections and scenarios. And you'll see that moving the goalpost goes on all of the time. Okay, I wanted to show you this particular graph because this shows you, and this is part of what Tony showed, the temperature increasing up to about 2000 and then leveling off and declining. Notice that in this portion it's called global warming, after it becomes climate change.
Tim, before you leave that slide, 1998
Yes.
features prominently.
Yeah.
Now, you'll notice, remember, those who saw me on Q&A with Brian Cox, I pointed out two things. The 1930s in his graph had been reduced in temperature. Tony confirmed that. I also pointed out that 1998 had been eliminated. And that means it produced a complete warming. That's all it was. Cox's graph was a phony complete. They reduced the most prominent temperature in the last 20 years.
Okay, the other thing is, of course, that what caused their problem here was that the temperature started to level off, but CO2 continued to increase, in complete contradiction of their hypothesis. And as Huxley said over 100 years ago, the great tragedy of science is a lovely hypothesis destroyed by an ugly fact. And this was their ugly fact. But instead of going back and looking at their science and saying the science is wrong, they moved the goalposts. They started calling it climate change instead of global warming. And that was deliberate, because if you click again, you'll see here, this is a 2004 leaked email from the Climategate emails. okay, from Menz at the Tyndall Center. He said, in my experience, global warming, freezing is already a bit of a public relations problem, okay? So already the public are starting, because we had a few cold winters, right? And see, where's that global warming you promised us? And of course, I had to tell people that global warming was just another undelivered government promise. But then Swedish chief climate negotiator Bo Yellen replied, I agree with Nick that climate change might be a better labeling than global warming. So they knew what was going on. This is all worked out and planned out. Go ahead. Okay, I'll just show you this very quickly because this one for the public is so important. This is the ice cores. This is Ali's plot of the ice cores. Here's the current temperature over here. Here's the little ice age, the medieval warm period. And so you can quite show with this that about 95% of the last 10,000 years has been warmer than today. And that absolutely shocks people to find that. And we talk about empirical evidence because this photograph is from Hubert Lamb's volume 2. It's a Picea glauca. We click the next one. It's a white spruce. It's 100 kilometers north of the current tree line. And for a tree of that dimension to grow at that latitude, and you can see here what I did was I plotted, it's radiocarbon dated at 5,000 years, and there you can see that global temperatures were at least 2 to 3 degrees warmer than at present. And if you know I've done a lot of studies on the trees at the tree line. I mean, you can get a tree right at the tree line today that's about, maybe that size. It's 120 years old. You need a microscope to see the tree ring growth. So this is empirical evidence that the Earth was much warmer in the past. Okay. They build in, this is from Agenda 21, Principle 15. And it is essentially a catch-all. You remember that earlier thing I showed you about they decide when there's a problem and they decide when you've reached the limits? Well, this is Principle 15. In order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach shall be applied by states according to their capabilities. So, of course, that's that socialist idea. Well, we'll make the rich pay and the poor don't have to pay. And where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be required. I don't fess with facts. We'll decide what's appropriate, right? And shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. This, of course, is the precautionary principle built into, in bureaucratic terms, put into the Agenda 21. And it just allows them to do whatever they want. They decide when there's a problem, and it's built there. I mentioned in my earlier comments about the Yale study. This is the grading of public knowledge of climate change, and you can see here that 77% failed the test. And it was really, the results are quite shocking. But it's why, of course, that the public simply say, I don't understand it, so I'm not worried about it. Okay, this is the most important quote. I put it on the back of both my books now. This is Klaus Eckert Pulse. And he says, 10 years ago, I simply parroted what the IPCC told us. One day, I started checking the facts and data. First, I started with a sense of doubt, but then I became outraged when I discovered that much of what the IPCC and the media were telling us was sheer nonsense, was not even supported by any scientific facts and measurements. To this day, I still feel shame that as a scientist, I made presentations of their science without first checking it. And of course, that speaks to the fact that when they say, well, there's 97% of scientists agree. No, 97% of scientists have never even looked at their science reports. Because the minute they look at them, they're stunned. And Tony mentioned Harrison Schmitt. I happened to be lucky enough to be invited to speak to his breakfast table in Washington when he started looking at this stuff, and he had a whole group of engineers around the table. They could not believe what they were hearing and seeing with regard to this climate science. Okay, this is my hero, Václav Klaus, Czech Republic leader, the only world leader that spoke out. He spoke at the first Heartland Conference on Climate in New York, and his opening comment was, We've just gone through 70 years of communism. Why the hell would you want to go back to that? Right? The room erupted. The room absolutely erupted. And of course, he wrote a actually difficult to get a hold of book now, and it speaks to Malcolm's point, Blue Planet in Green Shackles. I love that title. And of course, notice, what is endangered? Climate or freedom? And I think Viv would speak to that. Okay, I'll just finish up with my own advertising. This is the first book I brought out, The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science. I held off on it for 20 years because I knew the public were not ready. And even now, a lot of the public find it a hard slog. But I had to have it with enough footnotes and details to deflect a lot of the academic criticism, because that's where the worst attacks come from. It's the people, the academic world. This is the one I've just brought out. It's about 100 pages, a nice pocket edition, and hopefully will help people as they start to listen to what Tony's saying and what Malcolm is doing. Human-caused global warming, the biggest deception in history. And I've done it in a journalistic way, the who, what, where, why, how, and when this thing was achieved. And that's basically what I've summarized for you here. Thank you very much for your attention.